Hello.
Hello.
Oh, it looks like Lindsay's muted. You're muted, Lindsay.
Oh, that makes a lot more sense of that. I muted myself in two places, which is a basic
double
error.
muting. Yeah.
I double muting. Yeah. Hello. Welcome to the Saturday stream. Today, I've got a full Parliament of Rooks here today, and today we're going to be discussing all about that bass. I have forbidden myself from singing. I think it's for the best.
No, I disagree.
So this week we have myself, Graham Davis, Mark Gibbons, Andy Law, and Andy Least. Andy and Andy are next to each other, and they often aren't, so that'll be doubly confusing. Shall we start off by talking about what is a base? What are we talking about? Does anyone want to kick us off?
I'll start if no one else wants to start. You know me. I'm always happy to jump in. All right, for me, a base is something that your PCs can build and develop during play in your RPG. If your base is, for example, just a ship that gets you from A to B, it's not really a base, it's just a matter of conveyance. If your base can be built up as a ship as you're getting from A to B, then it's most definitely a base to me. In terms of discussing what is a base for RPG games, just simply being a house or some place where the PCs gather each week like an inn isn't really their base. For me, a base and using a base as a GM in-game is taking something that the players can build, possibly defend, and it need not simply be their castle, their boat, their ship. It could be a town. It could indeed be an entire province. It's all about something that the players can engage with, potentially as an entire mini-game almost by itself to the side, which will also, to a degree, speak to something we'll discuss in a couple of weeks when we discuss mini-games and using different types of mechanics in the background. So for me, a base is something you can build and the PCs can work with. Other people might disagree.
Does anybody disagree?
I mean, not really disagree. The one thing I sort of add to that is when you say build, the thing you might be building in that base is just relationships. So I think it doesn't necessarily need to be that they are, say, responsible for the defense of a town because they are the heroes of whatever. It may simply be a place where they return there regularly. They get to know the NPCs at a greater level. Minor background characters become almost friends of the PCs, so that there's an emotional investment there that then brings all the same stuff that sort of Andy was talking about. So
I'll have one small comeback from me. That's more location than a base per se, because that's something that the players are engaging with. For me, on the GM side, Andy's on the player side. For me, on the GM side, the base is very much something that the players themselves can invest in, and that might not just be emotionally. That might be, for example, with cash, something that's theirs.
Yeah, it could be. But what I'm saying is, if you're investing emotional time in, I like this place and I want to spend time here. I want to defend this place should it become threatened, that kind of thing. Then that's a different kind of investment. But I would argue that's also the player still building it up. So.
No, go ahead, Mark.
No, you go, Graham.
All right. It's an interesting point as to whether the base exists in a bubble outside the campaign and is untouched by it, or whether it's a part of it and can be attacked, defended, etc., and so on. And that may be the nub of the point that Andy and Andy were discussing.
Yep,
that's why I was laughing at.
I'm with Andy on this one.
Well done.
Clarify that. I found. Sorry, Lindsay.
I was just going to say I'm with Andy L.
Not helping.
You go, Mark.
I've been trying to get the Andys to come up with nicknames for themselves, and that's just so we don't have a confusion, because you can't be Andy L even, because that's still the both of them. But nothing seems to stick. I think I'm going to just assign names to the two of you as I see fit, and then hope they catch on. But on the subject of the basis, I always found when I was running campaigns that players like to have somewhere to come back to. And even if it was just, it's our favorite tavern we can go and drink and fight it in, at the end of every mission. I don't recall players sort of investing, as in like in property as such. I think they were inevitably just like, rent out the top floor of whatever hostelry they passed out in on any given occasion. So I don't have any strong recollections of them, truly. But I certainly know that they would rush back if anywhere they had any affection for was under threat, or whether it's from invading orcs or a tyrannical landlords or some sort of municipal horror.
Yeah, so Seago says, I had a party that lived in an inn, and after a few sessions decided to buy the inn. It didn't start out as a base, but ended up being one. And I was thinking, how is a base different from a place to live? So in Vampire is a good example of, like, almost everyone has some kind of haven, but that doesn't mean that every vampire and every coterie has a base. And through our vampire campaign that we played a good few years ago, we had various bases: a castle in Transylvania, underneath a monastery in Transylvania, a townhouse in Marseille. I mean, I can't think of what else did we have? Well, we had loads of different varieties, and they all came with different surrounding social structures and different things to build up and different benefits. But in Vampire, you've kind of got the merit and flaw system. Sorry, the you know what I mean? The dots in like the backgrounds, in like Haven or whatever that can demonstrate you building up that base.
I mean, presumably you have to have some sort of base as a vampire. You can't just go, I don't know where I'm going to spend the day. I'll just see where I wake up.
You'll be surprised.
You wouldn't live very long as a vampire, I would have thought.
Yeah, I'll run with this one and say that for me, I'm almost in some respects, I'm less interested in what individual games will offer for bases, because some games are actually built around building bases. For example, you use Vampire, saying that it's got a very, very simple little background system to give you an idea of the things that you've built up along with your resources, or something similar with your backgrounds. Other games are more heavily reliant upon building bases, whether it's your Forbidden Lands, or indeed if we go over to computer games, which often do these things very, very well indeed. If you move over to, say, Fallout, which has, say in Fallout 4, some lovely base building mechanics for building up all the various towns that you go to. I'm less interested per se in how each game individually manifests that, purely because some games are reliant on it and it's part of their structures. I'm more interested in, if I'm playing game X, what can I do to add in some base building, to add in something that my players can engage with? Because for me, that's more interesting as a conversation, because if we're just talking about an individual game, yeah, we'll be talking about that just game and how it does it, rather than saying, why do we want to do it? I mean, why do we even need a base in the first place? Yeah. What does it bring to the players?
Adrian says a base is anywhere a group of characters are emotionally attached to. But I definitely think for me, a base, like, that's a location that you like. But for me, a base is definitely something that you put resources into that you might get different or similar resources out of. Now, in a ship, if you're like building up your ship and like popping, I don't know, some weapons on it, then what you're getting out is, the more ease of defense as you wander from location to location, righting wrongs.
Or making wrongs.
Or making wrongs.
Yeah. Wrong rights, presumably.
Yeah. I didn't hear that.
Wrong
right is the opposite of right and wrong.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. One of the things that I particularly enjoy adding to a game, and I've built them in a variety of different ways, is giving the PC something that is theirs, that they can then develop. If we take, say, the Warhammer example, there's a clean example in the Enemy Within when you get a barge. And it shows one of the great strengths and potentially weaknesses of building a base. And that's that if you've got a base, a barge, in this particular case, I prefer adding to the mechanics that are already there and doing things like allowing you to build fore castles, aft castles, some sort of ablative armor down the sides. Let's hang a saint from one of the masts so we get ourselves some sort of little worshipping extra mechanic that we can drop in for the players. They can take the resources that they've gained through play and they can then invest those resources into the barge that they've got building. They can add extra weapons, pintle-mounted stuff, throw a mortar in there, and that's very much theirs. There is an issue with this, though, particularly if you're playing an ongoing campaign, and that is the famous one: what happens when they don't want to leave their base and you've got a story that you particularly want to tell? And that, to a degree, from the perspective of the GM, is something that you need to always consider. If I'm allowing this sort of mechanic to be brought into my game, is it going to impact the sort of story I want? And the answer is almost always yes, unless your story is intrinsically linked to the base. And I think that brings up a different question. Why use a base?
And I feel like one of the examples over on Facebook, a mutual friend of Andy and Lindsay and I, who's also called Andrew, confusingly, popped a post up there talking specifically about the Firefly RPG and its use of ships. And I think that's quite interesting because obviously in the TV show and in the movie Serenity, they regularly behind the scenes talked about how the ship is a character, and that was always a philosophy of that kind of piece of entertainment. So when they made the game, they did exactly the same thing, and there literally is a character sheet for your ship. Obviously, the stats and stuff are slightly different, but it is essentially a character sheet, just like your PCs would have, and that's how they're kind of presented. And I think that's quite a good example of the base absolutely fitting the kind of story you're going to tell in a Firefly RPG. Obviously, you can take the rules and play any kind of story you want to play, but hard baked into that license is it's about a ship that has a sense of character and a crew of individuals who are aboard that ship, traveling from place to place, having various misadventures. So therefore, it's hard baked into the sort of the DNA of the stories you're going to tell with that. I think, as you say, Andy, if it's not hard baked into the DNA of the game system that you're playing, that's when you might find it derailing things unless you plan it carefully. So
here's a question from Seagull. In Ship of Fools, which some viewers won't know what that means at all, bases were a moot point, so that was the adventure that the playtesters were playtesting for us as the party was moving from A to B. But once they get to the big city, will a base present themselves, or will the party just travel ever onward?
Good point. You'll watch this space.
Yeah.
We're not going to tell you that.
Yeah.
Come on.
Let's try. But I will say that I particularly, in fact, I'll go beyond particularly, I adore having hubs to work from. It's something that works very well in many role-playing games that are presented for computer. If you take, for example, Dragon Age almost always either starts off with its camps and then it goes, when you move into Inquisition, your actual castles that you're working out for, which again can be upgraded and developed as you go on. You make it yours. And I think that that's something that is really good for getting people invested in the game that you're building. It does potentially bring issues, as we've discussed before in some of our other streams, where people become more obsessed with the mini game that you've built than with the actual story at hand. A classic example again being with The Enemy Within. Everyone sails up and down the Reich with their barge, trading because it's so much fun. They buy new stuff, they upgrade their barge, everything's marvelous, and then they completely forget about the story at hand because that's just, as at that moment, more fun because people like to acquire stuff. So yeah, I'll say I love those mechanics and do watch this space because that sort of mechanics are almost certain to come through in some fashion, but nevertheless you need to make sure that they're grounded very much within the story being told.
Yeah, and you've touched on it a bit there, Andy, but maybe there'll be other thoughts. Bases are cool. Who doesn't like bases? Said Joe Smoke on Discord. Can you guys think of any games you've been in or systems you've looked at where the inclusion of a base actually acted to the detriment of the whole?
Not a specific example, but definitely in theory. You know, we've been talking about the barge in Death on the Reich and the ship in Firefly. That's a special case because the base is mobile, so you can go wherever you want. Whereas if your base is a building on dry land, then you can become tied to it. And if the campaign is not specifically set within the bounds of a certain area, that can be detrimental.
Yeah. I suppose it's a question of what kind of tools a GM has at their disposal to get past that problem, I guess. And obviously the most obvious tool is just talk to your players directly. Like, you know, we're all kind of responsible grown-ups. But thinking about like the vampire example, for instance, like it was a lot of fun in investing in our kind of areas and building up our kind of domains and things. But equally, particularly because we were playing starting in the Dark Ages but moving ourselves all the way through to Gehenna, it was very easy for the passage of time to erode that, or us leaving, or kind of various other things happen. So you get spanked, get knocked into torpor, wake up 80 years later, all those mortals that you were controlling are all dead now. Other people have taken over all of your property, and it's time to move on now. And again, the game gives you the tools. So I suppose it's harder in something like Warhammer. If your party aren't invested in kind of pursuing the plot threads, how do you hook them? And that's a bigger question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, Graham, you go.
Well, I think it comes down to a dialogue between the GM and the players, as Andy said, and what kind of game you want to run. If you want to run a localized game, to go back to Wolfrup, like an Uber's Right campaign or something, then a base is an absolutely fine thing to have. But if you just want to murder hobo about, or follow a sweeping plot line through multiple provinces, it's horses for courses, in short.
Mm-hmm. And Digital Dryad says that you tend to find one or two players get super into base building and the others end up twiddling their thumbs waiting for the story to progress. And Roderick says, I do want to go back to Rogue Trader at some point, as you do get to do base building with your ship, colonies, and even kind of nation building with your house.
That's cool. To go back to Digital Dryad's comment there as well, I think that is actually the real problem with the enemy within Barge, actually. As well, because I think it's relatively rare that the entire party are more invested in trading goods on a river than fighting monsters and defeating chaos.
Right.
I mean, it probably does happen sometimes, but certainly in my experience, one or two members of the party get super invested in it. Generally, those people
it's a
who
good
are
job that someone else in the party might steal their boat.
Steal that boat, yeah.
I'm going to reinforce that one and say that I cannot agree with this point more. And with a general recommendation of, if you do have a base building mechanic that's incorporated inside the existing role-playing game that you're playing, it's often worth taking those mechanics out of the game itself and doing them between sessions, because that means the people who are actually engaged with, for example, building up the local town, or trying to build a new inn, or trying to add a new engine on the ship, or anything similar, they can work in the parts that they enjoy. Everyone else can have a quick bit of input at the beginning or at the end of the session, or it can become a story part of a particular session when there's a particular thing that they're looking to build for their base. That becomes very much the story of the roleplay session at hand. But if you make it a focal point for the session that might take an hour or so, if you've got people who don't enjoy that aspect of it, it can become quite a drag for them, and you're going to find people on their phones.
Yeah, and as Digital Dryad says, on the plus side, it lets those folk who love micromanaging do things in between the sessions.
Oh yeah,
but that's something that can just make more effort for the GM.
But
Ralph has got. Sorry,
Andy. Well, I was just going to say, like it can be good for other things in terms of that downtime mechanic, though, as well, because it allows you, if you're running a campaign that's perhaps more about like character development and character interaction as well, the base, which is, as we've discussed before, also a location, perhaps allows you to do more character-based stuff as well, to be like, okay, well, my character's a wizard or a scholar or whatever, and he's building up a library in there, and then, okay, well, maybe I can do some research, and then the GM can maybe share some cool kind of backstory stuff that's maybe actually plot hooks for future sessions, and suddenly what was a distraction and a detriment, with a bit of thought and consideration, manipulation, can end up becoming a hook and something quite positive for driving the story forward. So I'm citing that just because that's a specific thing that Andy did with our Warhammer game with my wizard character.
Yeah, and some systems are having that baked in now. Vesson comes immediately to mind with the headquarters. You can add on certain rooms that give you certain downtime benefits, specifically the library. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
And
there, whoa, that's a strong hissing sound there.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Strange. So Ralph has got. There's multiple parts to this comment, but I quite like it, and you need to get them all to actually get to the point I'm going to make. So base almost always provides an emotional connection with members of the party. Had an AD&D campaign once based in and around Waterdeep, and what was it called? Different parts of the same campaign, and they all had one base, an old house called Cold Comfort. It was old and damp, but it was a home, and whoever came home could be part of the next adventure, which is interesting because like a base is almost like what you have in a TV series, and when you get to come back to the base, you become part of main cast instead of just recurring. And Ralph says there were about 15 players and even more characters. So that is a really big kind of presumably more troop style play. You can play different characters, but they all felt connected due to that place they called home. So I guess that's something that is useful for a base that maybe we've used in our games, where you might be playing multiple characters and you're almost picking the ones, almost like in something like XCOM, where you pick your team and you pick the most appropriate one, and then there's a place for those other characters to stay behind, to be building up, to be doing things while you're doing something like on location in your adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I mean, it almost dials back to Ars Magica and how it dealt with its larger troops style play. And again, that's a game that's built around building up the resources behind the scenes so your individual characters can go out and go. I like those style of games. They can work, but you've got to make sure you've got an entire rule set in place to furnish them, or it can end up being quite bitty. So all of the players, when they're getting back and they've got something they can engage with, what exactly are they engaging with? What benefits did they get? And you'll often find if you build a town and the players get engaged with it, they're going to immediately say, I'd like to build it further. It happens. And if you don't have something prepared for that, you're going to be making stuff up on the fly. It'll be inconsistent. You'll suddenly start adding resources to your game just because you think that might work. And then the week after deciding, maybe I need different resources. I went for wood and stone to begin with. Now I need something else. So if you are intending on doing something like that, it is always worthwhile either going out to another game, taking a look through how it's dealt with it so that you can build it up, or alternatively sitting down and building your own systems. And the easiest way to do that, I would strongly recommend, is just go to any old role-playing game, or often strategy games on the computer game side, see how they've done it, and all their systems are almost certain to be online. So if you want, you could do something like, I'm going to build up a town using, say, Rome Total War. And I'll take all the barracks that they offer. I'm going to take on all the diplomatic options it offers. I'll uplift them. I'll drop them down in my game. I can use similar types of resources. And you've already got, for your own game at home, a very simple, quick system that you can add on. And the same goes for simpler games, like, say, Darkest Dungeon, where you can take the very simpler mechanics of that for adding some extra bits. Add a brothel here, let's add a tavern over there, and do something similar. Again, depending upon what you personally prefer for the level of depth that you prefer for your game.
And FlipTop says that they use
straight to brothel.
Discord.
That's the one that came to mind. that's
I played Assassin's Creed.
It is Assassin's Creed's fault.
Roderick says it's funny that the best example of separation of base and plot is good old Mind's Eye Theatre, Vampire the Masquerade. Play with your influences, downtime, then go LARP at the game. I suppose that makes sense.
Yeah, worked well.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And I like this comment, and we should come back to this in minigames. I run a WFRIP 4th Ed game with a village where they have to collect every villager themselves. I seem to have stressed maintenance of the village too much, though, and they got bothered by the returning problems of food, etc.
I think that speaks to what I was discussing before as well, regarding making sure that you've got a very clear system in mind before you present it to the players. Because if you don't, you tend to find that they'll focus on parts that you didn't really think through as much as you necessarily perhaps should have, and then suddenly it all starts to crumble and fall apart. Having something there is a good idea.
Absolutely. The number of times I've done a system on the fly and inadvertently created a horrendous exploit that the players immediately spot and seize upon.
Every time.
And Digital Dryad says, on the other side of things, you can totally build entire session and games around base settlement country building. You certainly can. I know some groups who use a quiet year to build their campaign settings together in Proto Session 0 before they dive into the game itself. Works as a good way to front load player investment before the game starts. That's quite interesting.
And I guess I need to meet my weekly quota of talking about Conspiracy X, as was predicted on the Discord forum. But that's exactly how it works at Conspiracy X, is that obviously your character has your various strings that you can pull that represent the resources they can have based on their backgrounds. And then you can then, sort of the creation, at the genesis of it, you can use those resource points to kind of invest in your base, which can then be upgraded later. But it does mean immediately you're already working in that Session 0 as a team to decide how best to take the things your character's got access to and kind of build something exciting. So,
Yeah.
I have to say, so Kreutzhofen from Death's Dark Shadow is another example for a base.
Yes,
My players were used to traveling around due to the... So I spent much too much time on Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time forums, and I mean, I'm going to say the 90s, maybe the early 2000s, because whenever I see TEW, I want to say the eye of the world. That's how much time I spent on those forums.
Wow.
So yeah, and staying in one village made them consider the whole area as their base.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually quite a common theme for quite a few Warhammer games that I've seen running around. Even if it's a small group, they'll often work out of a village and then spread out from that particular point. They might make their own maps, they might build from that, or alternatively, they might use a setting that's established, like say Ubersreich, and then help build from that. It's very, very common, and it works pretty well because you can get your map, you can point at your map, you can try out different things, build your alliances, allegiances with all the locals. It's a common thing. But again, if you don't have some form of mechanic to help the base building aspect, you end up with exactly what Andy was discussing at the beginning: emotional connections, which are super good, but they don't necessarily have any tie to stay. And sometimes that's a good thing to add if you can. The second people spend money on a thing, they don't want to lose it.
Yeah.
They just don't. It's mine now. I'm a capitalist all of a sudden, and I'm no longer saving anyone. I'm protecting my house. God damn it!
I think even like fake money. Like I think even if you introduce resources that they have gathered and then spent, even though it's not actually gold crowns, they've spent something. And I think you're right. There is something. I don't know if it is our capitalist upbringing, but there is something that then does make you feel well. It's the sunk costs fallacy, isn't it? I suppose just written in TTRPG.
Yeah, and I actually, in some games, that feels more intrusive than others. Like in Vampire, I don't think it does, because having that base and having lots of resources and being Vampire is a game that's all about power. So the idea that you are defending the power you have isn't actually that obtrusive in that game, I think.
No, it's intrinsic.
Contrary-wise, though, vampires are basically glamorous international jet setters who don't have an attachment to places and material things because they've been everywhere and seen everything. So, psychologically, arguably for a vampire, it would be easier to abandon a base and start up somewhere else.
Some vampires.
Yeah. I
think some vampires have lived for like 2,000 years in the place they were born in. They're probably pretty.
Yeah, and there's that whole Simshay thing being connected to the earth, much like Dracula's
thing
of kind of needing to take the soil.
The native soil.
Which doesn't mean you can't move, but it does. But I think that just to go off on a tangent about Vampire, which is a game I think we all love. I think that's one of the nice things about it, is that it plunders from all the different myths of the vampire, so you can construct vampires according to whatever aspect most interests you.
So here's a question: should you, as a GM, give the party a base from the outset? Seagoat says, from experience, no. If they have to work for it, they'll be more likely to be invested in it.
I'll drop two answers on that one. The first one would be if you're playing a short-term one, and that's exactly what you want to do, sure. Particularly if it's a game that's based around base building or something similar, you're going to be dropping them in it quite quickly. It happens in many a computer game. You go off, you do yourself a quick adventure, you arrive at your new base, it's a crumble-down castle, it's time to start building that castle up and becoming the center of everything. Very common plot line. But I will then also say I agree completely. If you want to get something for a longer term campaign and you want proper emotional investment, having the characters actually fight for the thing that they get hold of, and not just we stormed the castle, it's ours now, but something that they've actually secured through their own skills or their own success, makes a significant difference for ensuring that they're interested in it. I will add one little extra comment on that as well. If you do add a base to a game that doesn't have one already, I would spend a good bit of time considering why and what is the tone of your game. What is the general mood? What is the general things that you want your game to do? Because that will change the nature of the sort of base that you should present. If your game's all about, just to pick a random theme, betrayal, so then how they get the base should be based on betrayal. Keeping the base should be based on betrayal. All the things that are working around
losing the base
should be based on betrayal. And ensuring that the base that you've built works around that theme, whatever your theme may be, it could be greed, it could be anything, is very important. And ensuring that you construct something that supports the central pillar of what you're building as a game, even if that game is adventurous, woohoo! Ensuring that the base is adventurous and woohoo is super important.
There's so many comments, so I'm not going to read them. I'm just popping them up. So for the videos afterwards, people can read them. So Digital Dryad says the hardest thing in my experience with static base building is keeping the feeling of exploration and surprise. Once folk have a detailed map of the surrounding area, it's not like you can just drop a dungeon castle on their doorstep, or I guess you could with magic. And Digital Dryad follows that up with, "This is why I love airships." Question: are airships the best bases?
If you're playing Final Fantasy, yes.
As long as nobody in the party is like a fire mage or a smoker, then yeah.
We haven't talked about, in World of Darkness, we talked a bit about
cairns.
Vampire, but there was a comment about mummies earlier on. But yeah, werewolves are massively built around cairns, aren't they?
I think in general you can say that there's a lot of games that are built around protecting a place. And I think it's as simple as that, rather than picking out each individual game. There are quite a few games that it's intrinsic to the setting. And I think that's, from our perspective as people who are playing all the various games that we like, it's super useful, because we can then, whenever we're presenting a game that doesn't necessarily have those mechanics, we can look at all those other games and go, well, I like that bit, I like that bit, and I like that bit. And then you can take it in. And as a GM, through and through to my heart, that's largely what I do. I plunder, steal, and take from absolutely everything to try and make sure that I present the best option for whatever game that we happen to be presenting at the time.
Ralph says the Enterprise crew would agree about airships being the best bases. No, just So here's a question scenario: your players have left their base and all their dear NPC friends behind for 1 or so year to go adventuring. They triumphantly return, but the village is ... How would you use that hook? Anything the GM should be wary of?
Wow, so many different potential answers to that one.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
My mind boggles.
Let's have a single word from everyone. Graham, what's your word? What would you do? The village is...
The village is taken over by the trusted NPCs you left behind to protect it, and they have become tyrants.
Wow, single.
Nice.
That is a long single word, but
There's a lot of dashes.
single idea. Mark,
It's a German-style compound word.
I was going to say abandoned, which doesn't necessarily give you as many options as Graham's suggestion. So it becomes a mystery. What happened to the
mystery,
villages?
like the Marie Celeste. Yep.
Exactly.
Andy
Mystery
Leaf?
to investigate.
I go one step further. It's vanished without a trace. There's not even a footprint of it in the ground anymore.
Hellmouth.
Wow, that escalated quickly.
I'm just going to say
on
it's afflicted by a plague. Clearly, I'm not a GM.
On that, sorry. What I was going to say is on the last part of the comment there about anything a GM should be wary of. The one thing I'd say is as a player, if the game seems to have been predicated upon them investing time and resources in building it up, you need to be wary about snatching it away with them entirely. Like absolutely. So like, you know, if you're going to have it abandoned or disappeared or taken over by the NPCs, the point has to be that there is capacity for them to somehow get it back or discover what happened, and it becomes part of the story. Arbitrarily just snatching it off of them will just leave your players a bit disgruntled. That's
cruel, yes.
Yeah, just the social contract was we were playing this kind of game, and then you've just broken the social contract. That I think genuinely is probably the only thing a GM has to be wary of. Anything else, as long as you're telling a story that you want to tell and the players want to play in, I think all bets are off. I think anything goes. But
Oh, here's a good one from Ralph. This is very like, I don't know, fairy tale, Brothers Grimm. 100 years have passed in that place.
That's great. Yeah.
Why didn't we leave a village here?
Where do we park the village?
I'd like to.
Sorry, I was just going to Graham's comment. Your idea, Genghis Keith says that scenario sounds like the Hobbits returning to the Shire after Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to mirror what Andy said because I think there's something really important there. Quite a few games will build a character sheet, much like was suggested earlier for Firefly, or similar for your base. And if you're doing anything that has a mechanic that builds up extras, that's effectively a character sheet. So if you take that away from your players, you're killing that character. and you are massively influencing what they believed was the game that they were playing. So you have to be super careful. So, for example, if you do the Hellmouth, you're better going down the more Buffy route, where everything looks like it's normal, but something horrible and insidious has slipped in behind the scenes, than you are with the gigantic pit that descends into the fiery lava below with demons.
Tricky to come back,
tricky
to rebuild under those circumstances.
Totally
Yeah,
is.
and Seagoat says having the game world affect the base is how you move the party from A to B, get the party to start the new adventure, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Graham, we've lost you, Graham. You are speaking.
How about now?
but no sound.
Oh, yeah,
Yep, you're back.
Yeah. I muted myself to clear my throat just now. Anyway, so the trick is you can take the base away, provided you don't do it behind the party's back and make them feel cheated. Make them watch, give them a chance to save it, and
Yeah,
that was awkward turtle because of the aforementioned one of my characters stole the party's boat in our last outing.
I think it's interesting. I think the Anything Barge has become such a it's so iconic, well known now,
isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly, that we knew like it was only a matter of time before something was going to happen to that barge.
Yeah,
we knew there was no way we were going to safely get to use it. You know?
It was only a matter of time before the halflings descended into madness and asked to learn sorcery from a chaos sorcerer. So,
yeah, indeed.
In my defense, they couldn't be trusted with
and
that
then I will
barge
say,
and that sorcerer.
in my defense, the players did this entirely by themselves. I had already built into the Warhammer map approximately 15 years ago a river that went to Middenheim for this reason. It doesn't go directly to Middenheim, but it goes really close. So you can go all the way up by barge almost to Middenheim. So they didn't need to lose the barge. They did it all themselves. And that, I think, is almost the best type. I think that's, in many respects, one of the better ways of dealing with a base removal, and you make it a consequence of the player's actions rather than necessarily something that's imposed upon them. The obvious imposition is an invasion of some sort that takes it away, but having something where the players themselves are tempted can be more fun.
Yeah, in this case, I can't be blamed for dealing with the other player's bad, irresponsible choices.
No. and for the GM to take it upon themselves is, like the James Wallace sank my barge, and it's sort of the equivalent of the old dungeon cliche of when the GM's overwhelmed. Okay, the roof collapses, you're all dead.
That's great GMing.
I sense that you've done that, Andy.
No, never. In fact, it's one of the things that I particularly dislike because it speaks to older school role-playing where there was a definite sense of GM versus players. GM builds a dungeon, the players then try to assault the dungeon. And as people built up on top of that with extra rules, for example, now I've come back from my dungeon, I want to build a keep. So they build their keep. There was still that feeling behind the scenes of, I built it in spite of the GM, not in development to a story or not because we're all doing well or anything similar. It's I've beat the GM and got my keep. And you'll find that turned, particularly back in the 80s, for quite a few GMs who were looking at ways to destroy the stuff the players had because they felt like they were pitched against them, like an evil wizard player in the Hero Quest board game, where your job is one thing only: kill the players. That's it.
Yeah.
And not my style of game in general.
No.
This is a good example of a logical consequence for players. I had players stand trial and become public enemy number one in their home settlement once due to amoral actions, namely stealing. Quite reasonable.
Yeah, I think
is an outlaw on multiple occasions.
As you should do. I mean, whenever you leave Altdorf, you should always have the outlaw career as an option. It's just how it works. But I agree with this in general, and also specifically, in that ensuring that when bases are removed, it's a part of a consequence of player action is almost always better than James Wallacing it and sinking the fucking barge. Just because you had to get rid of it somehow so they could progress with the plot. You're far better coming up with, if I'm going to have barge as part of my plot, or if I'm going to have a spaceship taking me from A to B as part of a traveler game, or anything similar, and then I want to change the campaign into a different sort of campaign, have yourself something built into that to ensure that happens. And it is an organic part of the game rather than they have something that they have invested time and soul into. Because if you have something that you like taken away, you're automatically going to be annoyed. I know I am.
Are you then suggesting that I put them in a situation in which their home is put at risk only if they deserve it?
I think risk is fine, and constantly throwing risks and jeopardy at bases, at the characters, or anything similar is also fine. Also allowing choices. I mean, there's some very bad base building example in computer games. Take, for example, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, where you had all the gang territory that you had to defend. Often that would intrude in playing the game because you're too busy defending territory all over the place, and if you didn't, you lost stuff that you had gathered. That's bad base building from the GM's perspective because it intrudes on the gameplay that the players are enjoying with. But adding jeopardy and building in as part of the story, like all the time, if they fail at that and it's their own fault and they lose it, then that's how it works.
That's the ideal way to neutralize a PC base, is in such a way that they have only themselves to blame.
Yeah.
I really like this one, though, from Seago. I created an NPC lawyer to handle all the legal aspects of purchasing and building and amending their base. He was corrupt and asked for favors as payment. Hilarity ensued.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds like a low haven.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Sounds like a lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah. And having, as we've said, the mechanics of building and maintaining a base can take away from the fun of adventuring. So NPCs are the perfect solution for that. But they're not bots. They are NPCs. They are characters. They're fallible. They're greedy. They're everything. And hilarity often ensues.
I think that's actually something to a degree explode out a little and say that as you're building your bases, whatever they may be, building the NPCs that are incorporated in those bases is just as important as the base building itself. And also ensuring that not only are they realistic people who have their own hopes and drives, but they're also story pushers. They're driving the narrative forward.
Absolutely.
Because they all have their own hopes and dreams and they're going to go off in different directions. And trying not to pander to the PCs too much, which is a GM, particularly GMs who are focusing on story, they often pander to the PCs and whatever the PCs want, and allowing the NPCs to go and do their own thing and sometimes say goodbye. So even the favorite NPC leaves because they themselves have got a problem with their family or something else has popped up, or they've long held a particular dream to do something. You sow the seeds that those things are coming, you then allow it to occur, and then they lose the NPC that was so important to them to protect their, let's say it was a village, their smith, or if it's their ship, they lose their engineer, or whatever it might be. But building NPCs that feel true to the setting and to the story that you're telling is super important. And to conclude on that, on the theme and the mood that I mentioned earlier, if you tap in what the NPC motivations are to your core theme, then suddenly you've got yourself a bunch of NPCs who are all acting in a variety of ways that you don't need to spend an enormous amount of time worrying about, because the very theme itself will try driving them forward. Now, the players might not know that everyone's a betraying bastard at heart, because you're playing a campaign about betrayal with perhaps a facade of something else placed in front of it. But as the campaign unfolds, they will see not just the settlement or the ship or whatever that they're in reflecting the general mood, but the actual NPCs that are working through it as well.
Here's one. Base NPCs are one of the great motivators to prevent using charisma as a dump stat.
Yeah, well, particularly if you have a haggling mechanic or anything similar built into the game, and you specifically say to players that in the real world, people don't all send their mate to do their shopping. You have to do your own shopping. So the person with charisma is not doing all the shopping. God damn it! If you want something, buy it yourself, you lazy so and so. Then suddenly charisma looks a little bit more useful as they go, well, I don't want to pay through the nose for all these things. So yeah, agreed completely.
Yeah, or the uncharismatic PC won't have NPCs around for very long. They'll move to a different village. I do think that sometimes the narrative flow, you feel like you're on a line in the party and it just goes where it will, and you almost don't see the consequences behind you or around you. And the most recent game that we were playing, which was based on a a Discord channel, so we saw it. We built it up in the week, in between sessions. Andy would give us a choice of adventures, like on the Wednesday, and then he would prep on the Friday. So, and it would be like 3 plot hooks, like the smith needs this kind of metal from the bog. Someone else is worried about supplies not getting through, and we would pick one of the 3. And then at the end of that, when we'd done that, we would see the fallout of the fact that we hadn't picked the other ones.
Oh, no.
And I found that like really quite, like, I was like, no, that's did I pick the wrong one? And then I would agonize over.
Yeah, because the assumption, of course, is that, oh, well, I can pick either one of those plots next week. Do you know what I mean? It's like they're there, they're frozen in time until you select them. And to realize that the players realize that the world doesn't revolve around them, I think is really key. So yes, well done, Andy, for that.
Yeah, and then people went out into the bog and went missing, and then in the next week, the adventure was like, do you want to go and look for that person in the bog? And we were like, but if we look for that person in the bog, what's going to happen to this person? Oh, it was very difficult to deal with for an anxious person.
Sorry.
But also,
I agree with
really realistic.
Yeah, I agree with Mark entirely, though, that it's something that we can do as role players that you can't get with a computer game version. With a computer game version, it tends to be a binary. We've got a quest. Have we done the quest? No, we haven't. That quest has failed. And then we move on. Where when we're doing it as a role-playing set of sessions, we can have an ongoing set of consequences progressing forward, considering each one of the various plot threads that you present. If a plot thread is followed, others start to collapse. If they bounce over to these ones start to collapse, and you can organically develop those in a way that you simply can't do easily, at least, with a computer game. And it's one of the things that I find, particularly with role-playing games, is enjoyable to see. The far more vivid, real development of the plots and the stories and the narratives that you can take to the players.
That's something we should talk about in a future stream where we come back. We're going to be talking about narrative design at sometime in September or October.
It's September.
We'll come back to that one. So here's a question from Smiling Tom. When it comes to handling bases, do people prefer actual quantifiable stats or go for a more narrative mechanic like tags or overall values like stability, wealth?
Both. For me, I will, depending on the game at hand, but I think all of them have got benefits and all of them have got methods that will make the game better according to what you yourself are going for.
Yeah.
Exactly what
I agree with Seago there. Yeah.
I mean, for some games, it's much better to have it nice and fluid and not worry too much about individual stats. For other games, it's really fun to micromanage. Do I have enough to build this particular thing? Do I have enough to build this particular thing? Can I now to go back to the boat, slap a corpse on my mast because I want to have a saint wrapped up in various linens up there because I want to be able to pray to it each week. That'll cost so much, and they'll also have the upkeep. And should they lose it, there'll be a very real sense of I spent something and it's been lost, which you can only get if you actually have some sort of buying mechanic built in. Where the looser side of things, there's sometimes less investment. It does, though, depend on the game at hand.
FlipTop says they do both, and earlier in the stream they made a comment about their Lustria game where it started with survival mechanics, moved to small village mechanics like getting villagers, and has now moved to kingdom management mechanics, presumably why they do both, and maybe more because they're operating multiple different kinds of bases. Ralph says he goes with the emotional value. And also, just to pick up the point about the multiple plots, Ralph plans to do that with Uber's Reich, overwhelming them with plots they need to pick as the watch. So is all your party going to be in the watch?
They'll presumably do making the rounds, from the starter set.
But
that's interesting. I mean, that sounds like you're almost doing like a version of, I don't know, something like The Wire in Uber's Reich, where it doesn't matter. Every time you finally arrest one criminal and put them away, there's just someone else exactly the same takes the same place because it's an institutional thing that's never going to get fixed. And again, that comes back to the idea of what kind of story are you wanting to tell? And
I can't stress that enough. If you as a GM know what sort of story you're going to tell beforehand, you'll find that all of the various locations that you build, the NPCs you build, if you need to have a base building mechanic or similar, will be naturally slotted into place simply by figuring out how these moods and themes that you're presenting can express in your game.
That's actually something I was going to ask you, that you as the writers, is do you prefer presenting players with a blank slate that they can craft into their own base, or do you like something very specific and very particular that although adaptable to what the players want to do with it, is significant and iconic as a location or base in its own right?
Do you want to go, Graham?
Yeah, I like to do both wherever possible. And that is to say, present something as a worked example and then expose the systems beneath it so people can do whatever they want in the future.
Yeah, it depends on the game at hand for me. If I was, for example, going to build a base building system into Warhammer, let's make a specific example. If I was to rejig, say, the enemy within part 2 and take that barge and add a complete basic building system to that, then I would go heavy into character, super heavy into making it Warhammer. We would have our corpses on our masts. We'd have soul lights doing things. We'd have all sorts of crows hanging around for more, and we'd have just loads of really cool classical stuff written down the sides of the boats to decorate it, and all sorts of very specific details that really brought it to life. And when you're dealing with a particular setting and wanting to bring that to life, those details are enormously important. If I was building something for someone's general, more fantasy game, then you're looking more general in total. You're talking about, if it's, say, a town, your taverns and your various locations. And whilst they may appear to be slightly dull, if you mix it up with how you can use them with the moods and your themes and similar, the stories that you can tell with them will be so personal to the individual GMs that what appears to be generic material on the page is actually at the table super, super cool. The number of times I've had, for example, at cons, somebody come up and say, you know, that inn that you did a map for at this particular point, it's been the center of my game for the last 10 years. This particular location is just the best. We've done everything with it, and so much so that we've used it multiple times in multiple games, because for us it is the archetypical inn that we use in a variety of different ways. And that was, in that particular instance, I think of the chap that spoke to me over in Essen, that was just the simplest of inn maps. It was really simple with a couple of lines to explain it all, but GMs expand upon those. So when I'm going generic, I like to be generic, but equally show how it can be used to turn into something that can be characterful.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Ralph, as a consumer, likes to get both. Some places detailed, some left open, like Kemperbad, which I can tailor to the PCs going through 4 or 5 times. I don't know if it was done on purpose. Was it Spires of Altdorf in Wifrip Second Ed that edition had the North Temple of Ulrich? Oh, was that you? Okay, it wasn't in the adventure itself. No,
however,
sorry, Graham, when you go.
No, it's okay. However, in the this is sort of verges into city adventures, but the old AD&D Lankmar supplement, if I remember correctly, had several blank areas on the map with what they called geomorphs that you could slot in a bunch of narrow alleys or wealthy streets or whatever to customize that way.
And you often find from the GM perspective, players loved picking up on those locations and turning them into their own. The GMs would spin something to slot in there, like little spiders making their webs. And then they would come in like moths, get trapped and wrapped up in the webs that had been created by the GM, then hopefully not get eaten and build into something new. That's, I think, from the base building perspective, it's always handy to have those gaps. But equally, particularly if we're, as writers, building settings, it's always useful for us to present examples of things that could work for that for you as well. Now, I'll admit that we're always a bit cagey with that, because often what we present becomes the template, and it is the thing that everybody uses. So we have to be relatively careful with the language we use to ensure that it's inspiring rather than restricting.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny to think that when D&D first started out, that the idea by the time your character got successful, wealthy enough to invest in a base, to build their keep by the sea, they were expected to retire the character and start a new one. They're meant to be the wandering adventurer, and then win the game. by having enough gold stashed away that you can settle down and retire.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that's another interesting thing. If you're playing in a persistent world where you've got the same players, but there is the capacity for characters to either retire through wealth or age or injury or that kind of thing. I suppose if you've got a stable base, that's a place where they can go instead of dying. Like they can retire there and become NPCs.
Yeah, a home for old adventurers. That'd be brilliant.
Yeah. Or like the barkeep in the local tavern becomes your old barbarian who lost an arm and he's not out fighting dragons anymore, but is there every week.
It's a classic.
Yeah,
it's a classic.
It is, and it sort of loops back to the troop style thing we were talking about earlier. That's where you can actually collect characters and then select some for particular adventures.
And again, you'll find that computer games do this quite well. If we take, say, Darkest Dungeon as the example I pulled up earlier, they've got a particular location which attracts new characters in. And they arrive and you can hire them and use them for other scenarios. And as I said earlier, stealing from the games that we all love is never a bad idea. If you find a cool idea somewhere, don't be afraid to go, well, it's mine now, yoink. It's often, particularly because computer games by many are seen as almost a completely different media and can't be integrated. It's nonsense. They're almost always the same. Particularly because they provide such good frameworks and skeletons, you can just, because you're playing a role-playing game, just slap the flesh on it with ease and present something to the players that is completely new while simultaneously being built off of something they all understand.
Marienburg's an interesting example because in Withrop it's sort of like on the, not in the Empire, and the border princes are similar. So it maybe offers more scope for GMs to create their own areas and, players to build their own, mini empires outside the main, more detailed area. Someone else has done much in Marienburg. Noctavagant. One constant in my game is that it keeps on burning down. We're on 3 or 4 times.
There you go. Like a constant in our game is, they always leave town as outlaws. Because they've done something terrible, and the police are after them. More normally, the local watch are corrupt, so they're chasing out the heroes.
We've been set up.
Sure.
And Seagoat says our base was an inn, and although we all came from some house or home, we ended up foregoing these to stay at the inn. You're playing some kind of TV series, clearly.
Yeah, totally. They've got the set that they have to reuse again.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. You can't go home.
Although that does come close to replicating my student days. I was very rarely seen outside a certain hostelry.
Actually, I'll pick up on this comment in particular. For me, this is the difference between an actual base and a location that the players are interacting with, where a base is something that, for me, and this is quite personal, I'll fully admit, that the players themselves are building and developing and working on. Where if it's an inn that they're working from, that's less a base than just one of the locations, a key location, admittedly, but a location that's inside the role-playing game that you're presenting. For me, there needs to be some form of development, a character sheet, for example, even if that's just defense 3, attack 2 for whatever it is that you happen to have as a base, or whether it's tavern 1 and I don't know, brothel 4, since apparently I'm stuck on brothels today, as the comments have popped up in the feed more than once, but brothel 3 or warehouse 5, or whether it's more detailed and it's how fast your ship moves, how many wheels it's got, if it happens to be a land ship. All of these things for me are more about the base building side rather than a location which is inherently important to your setting.
Well, so if I buy a dartboard for the pub, does that mean it's now a base?
Damn straight. No, it's your pub.
The Winchester.
Whereas it doesn't matter how much beer you buy, because as Terry Pratchett said, you don't really buy the beer so much as rent it. So.
Indeed.
Exactly.
They ended up helping out, running and defending the inn, so it did turn into a base.
And that is exactly what I'm saying. When you start with a location that turns into a base, and that is a perfect example of it. Thank you, Seagoat, for taking that step. It's beautiful, because that is, I think, an organic development of a location into something the players invest with, turns into a base, and then it's something that they're now running, helping defend, potentially building up, maybe putting a wizard's tower at the back because they've now got a wizard, or something similar. It then becomes theirs, and there can never be anything wrong with adding some player agency to your game and allowing them to control the setting that they're building with you as a GM.
Absolutely.
Great. And on that note, we come to the end of our stream. Please do consider joining us next week when we will be discussing, what are we discussing next week? I have it here.
Location,
I think.
location.
Yeah.
Cool.
And on that note, I bid you all a good evening. Thanks for joining me, Rooks, and speak to you next week.
99.